Skydio stands at the forefront of autonomous drone technology in the United States, innovating with advanced AI to deliver drones tailored for law enforcement and governmental applications. Established in 2014, our expertise spans AI, robotics, and electrical vehicle technologies, enabling us to craft the most intelligent flying machines that enhance public safety and operational efficiency. Hey, welcome back to Policing Matters on policeone.com. I'm your host, Jim Dudley. Welcome back. And be sure and check us out on the YouTube channel as well. Get a glimpse of our guest today. And unfortunately, I'll be there as well. So many of you would agree that law enforcement gave away the drug issues as more and more states decriminalize or even legalize drugs or reduce the penalties to those similar for other nuisance crimes. Well, still, despite declared as a health issue, we have seen the harms of drug-related crime that includes the black market, robbery, illegal grow facilities, organized gang activity, human trafficking, and even homicide. Well, overdose fatalities have grown annually in our nation from 20,000 deaths in 2000 to over 100,000 annually. The CDC shows that age-adjusted rate of drug overdose deaths has increased from 8.2 deaths per 100,000 standard population in 2002 to 32.6 in 2022. I've got the links below if you're interested in reading more from the Center for Disease Control. Well, this month we have news that the White House is signaling moving marijuana from the #1 Schedule 1 drug, the most harmful, the most addictive, with no medical benefits, to now a Class 3 drug, less harmful on the scale. Our guest today has been the director of the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center, NCRIC, and the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Agency, HIDA, for more than 20 years. Well, hey, it's great to see you again, Mike Sena. Welcome to Policing Matters.
Jim, thank you, and I really appreciate the invitation to be on this program.
Yeah, I've worked with Mike for several years during my career. He's been a great help. He provides the Northern California region with training and equipment and even personnel in some cases to fight the war on drugs. Well, Mike, we gave up our part of I guess we claimed armistice in the war on drugs. We turned it over to public health. How's that going so far?
Well, and I have to tell you, I looked at this and never as a war on drugs. It's combating the threats to our country from drug trafficking organization, organized crime, those folks that are harming our nation. And so when we look at when the HIDA program was originally established in 1988, the high intensity drug trafficking areas around the country, and there's 33 of those high intensity drug trafficking areas right now that cover over 60% of the U.S. population. There's over 22,000 task force officers full-time that are dedicated to this mission space. And, when we look at kind of the movement towards legalization of narcotics, bringing down penalties, adjusting penalties for even theft, which unfortunately you've got theft being driven by this drug market. If a person's a drug addict, in many cases, it's hard for them to work or have a desire to work. So they've got to make money to support these habits. So we had a lot of things change, especially in California, with adjustments in the law, reducing penalties for possession, reducing penalties for even distribution in some cases, and also reduction in penalties for theft. And so we saw an insane kind of change in our environment across law enforcement, especially since those changes were made. And the impact is what we're seeing in cities like San Francisco, probably one of those cities that has been hit the hardest. You look at just a small concentrated area where distribution of things like fentanyl has blown up. But as you looked at kind of the decrease in penalties and things like marijuana, we talk about the scheduling of marijuana. We've seen just an increase over the years of violence associated with marijuana trafficking. The concept and thought that drug trafficking organizations and individuals that are illicitly growing marijuana are all going to change all day and the market's going to dry up because of regulation. Well, it's actually harder for those businesses that are trying to, commit to the regulations and comply. And then why would a person that's selling the drugs for a lot less, leave? So a whole gray market is built out, but a gray market that is so flush with money right now that's where the violence comes from. It comes from people that are, heavily engaged in distribution and exchanging cash every day. So we're talking about millions and millions of dollars that, of course, isn't being taxed. And the end result is, in many ways, when you talk about people who get addicted to and start using marijuana, and people go, oh, you can't get addicted to that. No, there's people going into treatment for addiction to marijuana because they smoke it all the time. It's impacting their life. And we've seen what marijuana consumption does to the brains of adolescents. And everyone agrees that's a bad thing. So if it's bad for the kids, why is it good for the adults? It's a hard thing to see out there because the same groups that are moving marijuana are moving other drugs. And so it's this poly drug organizations. They're moving, you can get your marijuana, you can get your fentanyl, you get your cocaine, you get your meth, and you can get your marijuana, any way you want it. And so, and we saw that, as legalization occurred in California for marijuana, there was too much in the state of California. So it started getting pushed out across the country. And so our marijuana bled off to violence and other crimes across the entire United States. So we haven't seen a lot of great changes with legalization. And so this rescheduling of it just makes it even harder for us to deal with those drug trafficking organizations that are making so much money off of marijuana and fentanyl right now.
Yeah, and I think that's where the narrative is being pushed, right? You have, follow the money once again, and we see an industry pushing for legalization, or at least, I mean, it's been a decade fight of lowering marijuana from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, opens the door a little bit wider, just like you said. But then the black market, I've had economists at the university that I work at tell the press, the black market's going to go away. This is what they said 10 years ago. The black market is going to disappear. You just talked about the gray market, but
Yeah.
I'd counter that the black market is indeed alive and well. They don't have to pay the tariffs. They don't have to pay the taxes. They don't have the overhead. And we've seen the consequences of the quote legitimate pot stores being robbed, being burglarized, and organized crime as part and parcel of the marijuana trade. So, I mean, it's a dichotomy that you have the proponent saying it's safe. It's there's definitely medical benefits to it, and then on the other side, you see, well, nobody wants to flood the prisons with people selling marijuana or using marijuana. But just like you said, I think if we go back to the CDC, you'll see study after study that show some really chronic health problems that come from the chronic marijuana use. But we're not where Oregon was a year ago when Oregon essentially declared drugs legal. They saw, that plane hit the ground, and then they repealed it just January this year. Are we going to have to go through another phase of filling up hospitals and psychiatric facilities until we get back to level again with the whole drug issue?
I mean, that's a hard point. And I see a lot of this as an experiment with people's lives. There's kind of a core group of folks that have been on a long mission of saying, hey, we think that all drugs should be legal. But the consequences of that, and when you look at Oregon and the toll it has on people's lives and the community, I mean, let's look at fentanyl, and you mentioned, the hundreds of thousands of people that have died. If we had a mass casualty incident with 800 deaths in the city of San Francisco, you would think we'd have mobilization of every organization to combat that, and that it would be done. If we had a Al Qaeda attack, ISIS attack, or whatever the terrorist group is attack in San Francisco, we'd have every national asset in the country mobilizing to deal with that threat. And in the past, when we've had attacks like in New York City and Washington, D.C. and Pennsylvania, where, 9/11, all those incidents end up exploding. You look at how we mobilized every asset in our nation and military to combat that threat. So we have more people than that dying daily, in our country from all the threats that we're seeing across the board. It has not changed. So I'm looking at, and also have to say that, we started a project back in May of last year to combat the fentanyl threat, and we are dealing with enormous obstacles. And many of those obstacles are political obstacles. But, we're looking at a threat from, individuals that we've identified, coming up to 500 subjects that we've identified that are operating within the Tenderloin that are fentanyl dealers and dealing, of course, other drugs. So at what point do we change the paradigm? Do we say that this is a bad idea, that there is an actual threat killing more people in America than any man-made threat we've ever seen before? And unfortunately, I don't think nationwide we're at that point. A lot of times, we look at the community that is addicted to drugs, and people don't associate that with friends and family. But as we look at the fentanyl and opioid overdose issues, I can't go in a room and ask people, say, anyone that's impacted by this, has a friend or family member addicted or someone that they know who has died. It's rare to find a person in that room that doesn't raise their hand.
Right.
But we're still not at the point where people are saying, we've got to deal with the addiction issue. And true enforcement's part of it. And, in the HIDTA programs, big on, we've got to have the enforcement piece of it, but we also have to work with the public health piece of it. So, but just saying it's one group's problem to deal with is just wrong. It's a societal problem. And
Yeah.
it's
The domino effect. You mentioned it, the theft, the car break-ins, all of it, the homelessness, the drug addicted, the incited mentally ill. I mean, mental illness and drugs seem to have this symbiotic relationship where people tend to self-medicate because of the mental illness.
Yeah, and we can't ignore it. I mean, but it's one of those things where people have said, well, the war on drugs failed. Well, the war on drugs, I mean, there was no war on drugs. We're not fighting drugs. We're fighting the organizations that are profiting off the death of Americans and the enslavement of Americans. When you think of a drug addict, nobody wants to be a drug addict. Nobody, when they're a little kid, said, oh, I grew up, I want to be an addict. No, that's not the way it works. It works with somebody out there being offered some type of narcotics at some point in their life and going, I like this narcotic. I like the way it makes me feel better than this, better than that, better than anything in life eventually. And that's why fentanyl is one of those huge issues out there. And sometimes it starts with the marijuana usage. It starts with lower prescription drug usage. It starts with something else. No one just, I mean, rarely you have people that say, yeah, I want to be a fentanyl addict. They start other drugs and they're chasing that high that whatever drugs they used to start with gave them, that feeling that they had in their body that nothing else would match. And so when you look at people who are addicted to fentanyl, many of them started out with other drugs. There are those that accidentally take fentanyl because they think they're taking some other drug, Xanax or something like that, a pill. And that's why that campaign of one pill can kill is so important. But there are those out there that start out with some other drug and they're chasing that greatest high they ever had. And every person that has taken fentanyl that I've ever talked to said it's the best high they've ever had in their life. There's nothing that will ever feel like that first time. But then they have to take that drug every day. And that costs money. And they're enslaved to that drug. And so they will do anything for that drug. And some people do. They rob, they steal, they lie, they sell their bodies, they traffic other people. And so trying to stop this cycle that our nation is in is what we're engaged in. We work with public health. We work with those folks. But, it always worries me whenever I get out there and somebody says, we shouldn't do this war on drugs. People should not be incarcerated. And I agree. I don't want a bunch of people in prison who are addicts. I want them in treatment. But if you can't get a person with a hammer over their head sometimes and say, we need you to get treatment. And if you don't get treatment, you're going to go to prison. We don't have that anymore. we don't have that ability to say, all right, and because here's the thing, if you're given a choice of, all right, you can get yourself drug treatment or you can spend, 30 days in jail. I'll spend 30 days in jail. I like drugs and withdrawal is painful. Who wants to go through that? So they'll do and bide their time and potentially they can get drugs there too. So looking at that from the aspect of how do we stop this cycle, we got to stop it from the beginning. And we got to stop it from those lower level drugs that are kind of the kindling to the fire,
Hmm.
a lifetime of addiction, which we all pay for. We pay for that person's thefts. We pay for that person's time that they are repeatedly in the hospital. And there are people that are dying, literally dying over and over again on streets across America, and especially every day in San Francisco. You have three
But
people.
we're reviving them. We're
We're
reviving them.
reviving them. Yep, we are. We are. And
Hey, so let me ask you this: putting on your HIDA hat, your high intensity drug intervention. You say you have 66 HIDAs around the country.
33.
I'm sorry, 33, and we know marijuana, you can grow it just about anywhere, really. We've got the good climate here in California, but
Yep.
the initiating fentanyl, it's not like a meth lab, right? It's coming up from the borders. Is it made here? Can we control the chemicals that are used to make it? Where's that fight right now?
Well, and that one's even more complex. So, when you look at the chemical production of it, initially, and it's got great medical use. I mean, there is nothing that kills pain, more quickly and more effectively than fentanyl, medically dispensed. But the problem is that, when we started seeing it blow up in the United States, the majority of the labs were in China, unregulated labs. And a lot of that fentanyl was coming in right into SFO, coming in through the air mail facility there and being distributed across the country through, we've got these great logistics for shipping things these days. You could order anything from anywhere in the world and get it here in days, right? So same thing with fentanyl. So people could go on to the black market, and go online and order as much as they wanted. And so we had that fentanyl being shipped into San Francisco and then being distributed all across the country through mail shipments and through carrier shipments. So we had actually set up a task force to work at that airmail facility, and they're doing a phenomenal job. And within about 6 months, they figured out, hey, we're getting all this dope seized, and we need to change operations. And so at about the same time, Mexican drug trafficking organizations, having those conversations with Chinese groups saying, hey, you're having problems with distribution. We're great at distribution. And I was there in the 90s, working in narcotics in Southern California when, when the Colombians were looking for, better ways to move their dope with less liability into the country. And the Mexican drug trafficking organization took that over. And so same thing, Mexican drug trafficking organizations go, hey, we've got meth labs. We've had meth labs since, we did a lot of work in the 90s. I was part of that to combat meth lab production in California. And it became so hard to produce meth in California that they moved the labs down to Mexico. And so they already had a lab production mechanism in place. They just need to know how to do it. So they just need the right people to show them how to produce the fentanyl. And then the chemical supply, still China, still India, still other countries in Asia that are shipping those chemicals into Mexico, and they're producing ton quantities daily. I mean, that's why we're dealing with, the 14,000 plus kilograms that HIDA task forces have seized. I mean, that's a lot of freaking fentanyl. When you think that micrograms will kill a person,
Right.
14,000 plus kilograms of that seized, that's only a portion of what's out there. So that production level now in Mexico, I mean, there's, it's out of control. It really is. And the price that that the bulk is being produced at and shipped from pills is pennies. And those pennies at the border are $20 pills or maybe more in a city like San Francisco if you're buying pills.
Yeah.
So
And
no,
I'm sorry. And that's the intentional trafficking. Here we know that people are buying pills that they think are one thing, but if it's not a good quality product, it might be spiked with fentanyl, and the customer doesn't even know it.
No, and that's the problem, and that's where we see a number of deaths. And we've had actually in powder form where people thought they were buying cocaine and they snorted it. It's pure fentanyl, and they just drop dead. The other thing that we've seen, which is even more concerning, is xylazine. And xylazine is an animal tranquilizer. So, but adding that for a more sustained high, and it's cheap. It's extremely cheap. So using that and mixing that in, to them is just it's just genius to them. The only bad part is, and this is something that we looked at early on with fentanyl, there were a lot of people in the early days before fentanyl really blew up that said, why would drug trafficking organizations want to kill their customers? It makes no sense. You get no return business on that. So they just thought that was never going to happen until it did, until people, started taking fentanyl and realizing that was the best high they ever had and that they were willing to die for it. So now you've got people that are getting mixed xylazine. Now, the bad part about xylazine is we talk about the naloxone out there. Well, naloxone impedes and basically insulates those cells of the opioid in fentanyl and keeps it from killing the person, keeps them from going into pulmonary arrest and dying. Well, there is nothing for humans that will counteract xylazine. So they have it for dogs and animals because that's what it was built for, but they don't have a counteragent that will bring a person back from xylazine. So if you have a person that overdoses on fentanyl and xylazine, you could give them as much naloxone as you want. It's not going to bring them back. And that's a current big fear of ours, is that, we see this, huge flood of xylazine potentially in the future mixed up with fentanyl, that, if our one thing to bring people back doesn't work anymore, what do you do? And so, and when we talk about the model that drug trafficking organizations, why, that philosophy of why would they ever let their customers die? It's because not all of them die, and new customers are coming in, new addicts are coming in.
Yeah,
So,
they're lined up. I mean, there's no shortage of customers.
oh, absolutely, absolutely. And before we started our heavy operations in May of last year to combat the street dealing of fentanyl, they were lined up. Dealers were lined up. The customers were lined up, but dealers were lined up, and the dealers we had were taking turns. I mean, there was so much business out there that they could literally take a break and let another guy deal while they took their break. It was like this non-compete, that, hey, we're all making money here, and we could be on this corner all day long selling. It was almost like unionization. We're going to take a union break here, and you can sell while I'm on my break.
Wow.
Craziness. So, and that's why we had this flood of dealers in San Francisco on like every corner. I mean, hell, we had them selling right in front of the federal buildings in San Francisco, where, right across the street from the federal buildings, and in some cases, right on the curb of the newer federal building. It got to the point where even judges were saying, what can we do to get these people from stop selling out in the street?
Well, that's ironic because they are the last stand against these dealers, and we're still seeing the lenient sentencing.
Yeah, it's really hard to see. And then we have a whole group of juvenile dealers because, as people know that there's the juvenile justice system doesn't deal that well on many levels, but dealing with drug dealers, oftentimes, there was no one in major cities that's like, what do you do with all these kids? And so, in many cases, they're returned to their parents, and then they're right back on the street dealing drugs the next day, or
Right.
sometimes even the same day.
Yeah, and it's no accident because the adult drug dealers know that the penalties are less harsh for the juvenile
Oh,
mules.
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. Hey, I want to talk about solutions. Let's end this thing on a
Yeah, yeah,
high
yeah.
note. But first, I'd like to take a moment and thank our sponsor. Every incident demands quick, informed decisions, but limited resources and constantly changing environments make this tough. Join us at Skydio Ascend 2024 to see how drone as first responder technology enhances decision-making, and improves officer and community safety. Hear from leading agencies using DFR as a force multiplier and learn how they're shaping the future of public safety. This virtual event streams live on September 25th and 26th. Get your free ticket at skydio.com/ascend. That's skydio.com/ASCEND. And welcome back. And we're speaking with Mike Sena, the director of the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center, NCRIC, and the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Agency, HIDA. And Mike, you must be talking with your fellow directors across the country. What's the common string these days? Is the drug issue worse in some parts of the nation? Are we an epicenter here in Northern California?
Well, it's bad across the entire country. I mean, I wish I had good news that's saying, hey, there's pockets of success where fentanyl doesn't exist, or overdoses don't exist, or the black market, gray market for marijuana production isn't leading to violence because of all the cash that's being moved back and forth. But it's probably in the worst state I've seen in the 31 years I've been working. And that's based on the number of deaths, the level of violence that we had in the early 90s. We're not at that level of violence and gang warfare that we saw in the 80s and 90s to the crack epidemic out there. But what we are seeing is that we've got a greater number of deaths, and that's because of the overdoses and because of people getting in that cycle of addiction and the property crime and all the other things that are associated with sustaining that is we're in a bad place. But the things that we are trying to do is, one, we know the major drug trafficking organizations in Mexico that are primary distributors of the drugs. So there's a huge effort to focus on those drug trafficking organizations and trying to cut profits. That's the one thing that we have to figure out, because they can keep producing the narcotics, they can't print money. Although for 5 to 10 years now, selling drugs has almost been a license to print money, because there's so much cash that is produced, and so many addicts that are enslaved every day to do their criminal activity to support the drug habit and pay these drug trafficking organizations huge amounts of money. So the things that we are doing, focusing on those dealers out there, targeting them. And so just to give you an example, in San Francisco, we started a fentanyl distribution disruption working group in May of last year to bring together federal, state, local, tribal, all of our partners in public safety, along with our partners in public health, emergency management, everybody working together to try to address the threats on the multiple levels. And along the way, we did have the Asia Pacific Economic Council meeting last year. That was a huge event. And there was a huge push to say, we've got to deal with all these dealers. There's a dealer like on every corner. But I should say one dealer, multiple dealers in certain parts of the city, and primarily in the Tenderloin area, where there was just such an influx and people dying every day and overdosing every day. Not a day goes by, an ambulance and fire truck don't go by picking up, overdose victims. So our goal has been to, one, identify those dealers. And so we're over 700 dealers identified. Over 450 of those dealers were actually identified as Honduran nationals. And thanks to some great investigative reporting by a reporter at the San Francisco Chronicle, Megan Cassidy, she actually spent time with those drug dealers, and actually they told her a lot of things that she printed about where their money was going, how they were making cash, and how much they were making. And some of these folks were saying they're making $350,000 a year as a drug dealer on the streets of San Francisco. So part of this,
and they're not spending it here in San Francisco. They're taking it back to I read the series. They're taking it back to their home country, building these mansions there.
Oh, absolutely. And there's been some news episodes recently in the last few weeks of reporters going to those same locations and seeing these folks, off of the deaths of 800 folks a year in San Francisco, are building great homes in their own villages and their own areas in Honduras. And to top it off, they're putting the logos of the San Francisco sports teams on the gates of their homes and murals on their houses, because they've made such a profit, and their lives have changed for their families down there at the expense of the families here. And so part of that effort, beyond identifying those folks, is finding how they're moving their money. How's that money? And we did over the last year, thanks to some partners at the U.S. Attorney's Office, IRS, FBI, DEA, have found money service businesses that were laundering money for these Hondurans who were sending money back to Mexico and sending money back to Honduras to build these very large homes. So we're trying to cut out that portion of it. From the federal and local prosecutors. So I have to say that, thanks to, in San Francisco, Brooke Jenkins, thanks to our U.S. Attorney, Ismail Ramsey, they have actually been stepping up to the plate to start working on the prosecution side. There were no consequences in San Francisco prior to Brooke coming in, very minimal. And so not a lot of great prosecution going on, not a lot of trying to take down this organization. And on the HIDTA side, our part was, we need to identify the bad guys. We need to help coordinate the entities and partners and bring them together to the tables to talk about how we're going to combat the threat. So,
and are you doing that as a RICO Act sort of prosecution through feds?
Well, it hasn't got to the RICO piece yet. And so that probably is the next iteration of this. The initial phase of this was, we got to take care of the dealers on the streets immediately. And so U.S. Attorney's Office is taking cases and has already done over 75 cases on especially the Honduran traffickers, where they're given a short sentence, immediate deportation, and a longer prison sentence if they return. So, and that has a greater impact, because I'll tell you, before, when SFPD would arrest somebody, they would laugh it off. They're like, "Hey, I'm gonna go in for a day maybe, and I'll be back out making money." So then they'd get in the car and they're like, "Oh no, you're going to the federal building. You're going to be prosecuted federally, and you're going to get prison time." You got people crying then. And so it has that immediate impact of taking that person out of circulation. They're no longer going to be dealing drugs in San Francisco. So that's one part of the push. The other part of the push is working on those that are buying. And we don't want to harm the addict. We want to get the addict treatment. But if we can't get the addict into a system where they can get treatment, where they can get off the streets, it's not going to work. So working that angle is part of this as well. But I have to say that that combination of all those agencies working together, going out there and getting those dealers off the street, is one piece of it. Now, true, those dealers are getting a supply from Mexico. So that's where DEA has a huge foothold in that international drug trafficking aspect of it. Trying to work with Mexican authorities and other government partners to combat and really go after those groups in Mexico until we can get that mitigated, until we can get those labs taken down. They're going to keep producing drugs, and they're going to keep getting them across the border. So that's the strategy that we're working with right now. Is we got to deal with it at the international level and the local level at the same time. We've got to identify their money flow and how that money is getting out there. And we did have a money services businesses person that was laundering money for them that was recently sentenced for laundering that cash. So trying to figure out that cash flow, stop that. But also, San Francisco is an epicenter for distribution for hundreds and hundreds of miles, because everyone knows if they get to the Tenderloin, you don't have to know anybody. You just have to get on the street and find those guys who are dealing, and you'll get your supply. And that supply is going to other places.
And that's really just the tip of the iceberg, right? I mean, we've seen it, like you said, I was working on the streets in the 80s and the 90s. And one of the things that seemed to happen overnight was it went from street corner dealing to inside to go in electronically. First, it was through pagers, and now it's the internet. You can buy just about anything on the internet. There are apps that are pretty secure. You're a regional crime center, a fusion center, an intelligence center. Uh, you don't have to say all that you're doing, but I gotta think that you're using AI and you're using technology as well.
No, technology is a huge part of looking at the threat. Some of the downfalls of technology is, we've worked out coordination with social media companies on threat to life, where there's somebody that's saying, "Hey, I'm going to go kill someone," or "I'm going to kill myself," and getting streamlining reporting on that. We don't have the same for narcotics, and that is something that's gravely missing right now because we can't catch everything online. Not with the current technology and access that we have as far as the tools and resources. So trying to get those companies to also support that. Now, it's a violation of policy. So in the past, they'll turn off accounts if they identify narcotics trafficking, but that didn't always get reported to law enforcement. So we need some mechanism in place like that, like we've done for threat to life, where, this is a threat to people's lives. Narcotics dealing is dangerous and deadly. And so we need support from, the companies that are out there and reporting that information. But, there's so much activity also on the dark web. And that's the wild west of, of information, sharing that, is not that easy for people to get to in the first place. And it's hard to look at all of the markets that are out there and identifying those that are trafficking. Hell, we had, a person that was operating one of the largest online narcotics operations in the country when they first started doing that online like crazy. And he was doing it right in many cases from local locations in San Francisco, like the public library. All he needed was the internet to do his work. And so that market is still out there. That online market of distribution and mailing drugs is still alive. But in many cases, that's why those street dealers have also blown up because it breaks down barriers for having to know somebody, having to find that online market or store, knowing that you're actually going to get something with an online payment. You're going to get something handed to you. It may not be the dope you wanted in San Francisco, but there's going to be a cash transaction. It's very anonymous. You don't have anything online that tracks back to you. And so that's why we kind of saw this market blowing up with those street dealers in San Francisco, because people are fearful about what the government's doing on, they might be able to find me doing a transaction online. But if I drive into San Francisco, find some random guy on the corner that's selling dope, it's just that one-time transaction, and I'm driving off until I got to pick up the next supply.
Yeah, but that's a roll of the dice, and I guess that's something they're living with or not living with.
Or exactly.
Hey, totally thankful of your time, Mike Sena. So we've got our law enforcement listeners out there, and we're a NICRIC here in Northern California. There's RICs all over the country.
Yeah.
How can our law enforcement people out there find their RIC?
Well, and absolutely, there are 33 high-intensity drug trafficking areas with over 60 investigative support centers in that work within each of those HIDAs. We also have 80 fusion centers across the country. So there are 50 state centers. Each state has one. We have 27 major urban area centers, and then we have 3 territorial centers. So if folks are looking for their fusion center, they can go to the National Fusion Center Association website, which is NFCA. USA.org, NFCAUSA.org, and they can find their fusion center. If they're looking for their HIDA, it's HIDAprogram.org, HIDTA program.org. They go to either of those sites and they can find their HIDA and their fusion center.
Yeah, and so at the top of the show, I mentioned the resources that you have available. How you doing these days with budget resources? Are you able to give the agencies what they need?
And we have been, we've had phenomenal support from our Bay Area Urban Area Security Initiative, from our State Homeland Security Program, and the support we get from California Office of Emergency Services, and all through the Department of Homeland Security grant funds. And then, of course, through the high intensity drug trafficking area, which is administered under the Office of National Drug Control Policy. So our budget's about $12 million a year for our program. And we have lots of resources, services available, training available to our law enforcement and public safety partners and homeland security partners. We train about 6,000 people a year. So if there's a listener here that's in law enforcement, public safety, homeland security, public health, there are classes that we have almost every week for folks out there, both online and in person. Technology is available to law enforcement for use in their investigations. We have a great team of analysts, detectives, sergeants, and others that are there to help support these major investigations across the region. And although we are probably looking at some looming Department of Homeland Security cuts this year, or next year, I should say, our goal is to make sure that we provide our region and our nation with all the services they need to protect the communities that they serve, all of our law enforcement and all of our public safety partners. And it's not just law enforcement that work in our center. We also have fire. We have emergency management personnel. We also have public health folks. So we do have a public health analyst that works thanks and courtesy to the Center for Disease Control Foundation. They're in the office. All these folks are working together to look at all these major threats that we're dealing with and come up with the best strategies possible to leverage our regional resources. We have hundreds of agencies in the Bay Area. Individually, we can't really address the threat. Together, we can drive change, we can make change, and we can push back on all the criminality and all the death that we're seeing in our region. We can't give up. And this is not a war on drugs. This is a war on those organizations that are profiting off of the death and harm to the members of our communities.
Nice. Well, thank you, Mike. And it's happening at 32 other centers across the country. So wherever you are, take a look on the websites. We'll list them in our show notes below as well. Thanks for being on the show, Mike Sena, Director of Northern California Regional Information Intelligence Center and the High Intensity Drug Trafficking Agency, HIDA. Thanks, Mike.
Oh, thank you. And I really appreciate your time on the show. And we're here for you and all of our partners. Thank you.
Great. Hey, to our listeners, thanks for listening. Let me know what you think. Are you working with your HIDA, with your information centers? Do you have somebody on a task force? Let us know. Drop us a line at policingmatters@policeone.com. policingmatters@policeone.com. And if you don't know the center near you, check out the links below and find out what they're doing. All right, take good care, stay safe, and hope to talk to you again real soon.